characteristics of the individuals who currently run to power after revolutions in the military make them particularly unsuited to fulfilling the role that the new country requires. Secondly, I'll describe why the existence of military officials in public office makes the structure of that country worse. And finally, I'll describe why we get better political revolutions under our side. Firstly, to clarify what particularly this policy looks like. We imagine that this takes place, as the topic defines, in the immediate aftermath of populist revolutions. We imagine that kind of the revolutionaries or the heads of those revolutionaries would make it clear to military officials as, for instance, the condition of their support that they not be allowed to run for public office, or should the revolution be successful. Obviously, in the immediate aftermath, public office does not include removing these individuals from their military positions. It's just that they would not be allowed to enter civilian positions of power, such as running for elected office. And we imagine that the kind of bar would take place as a sort of moratorium. So, for instance, it might be lifted after an appropriate period of time. We're agnostic as to particularly what that appropriate period of time is. We believe it's kind of one that's necessary to engage a relative level of stability in these countries. Quick point of information if there's any kind of uncertainty about the policy. If not, I'll move on to the first argument, which is that the characteristics of the individuals that run for office under the status quo make them uniquely unsuited to running for public office for three reasons. Firstly, the types of people that we're talking about who gain prominent positions in political revolutions that take place under the status quo, the best examples of this are people like Mao Zedong in the Communist Revolution in China, and people like Paul Kagame in Rwanda, are individuals who are already top military brass in the previous government of that country, which makes them uniquely unsuited to being the heads of state in the new post-revolution country or having a significant position of public office in the new country, for the reason that they are the most likely to, firstly, bear some sort of nostalgia or some sort of ongoing connection to the previous country in terms of, for instance, or secondly, and more importantly, that they are more likely to be the types of individuals willing to engage in the types of behaviours that are necessary to curry favour in a country in which these political revolutions occur. Yeah, and what I mean by that is, for instance, Paul Kagame, in order to be the head of the military in Rwanda pre the revolution, needed to engage in the sorts of corrupt behaviours that allowed individuals to be promoted in a country that did not have stable democratic rule, and that makes it more likely that he will be willing to replicate those behaviours in the aftermath of a political revolution. No. Secondly, we think that these military leaders are uniquely poor at engaging in the type of unification that is necessary to effectively construct new national identities after the existence of a political revolution. The reason that, firstly, often military leaders will be directly responsible for the deaths of individuals in the immediate aftermath of political revolutions, which means that they are far more likely to be divisive than individuals who can reasonably give the excuse, for instance, of merely being a revolutionary and not having directly caused those deaths. Or, secondly, it is far less likely that in circumstances where the military, for instance, causes undue civilian casualties, they will be far less willing to hold their own to account than individuals who are, for instance, civilian revolutionaries who do not bear those same incentives. Thirdly, we would suggest that these individuals tend to be particularly militaristic in their thinking. Often these individuals are lifetime military generals who have devoted their entire lives to serving the military, and therefore uniquely unsuited to making the transition from a relative state of emergency, which is what occurs during political crises, to one in which individuals have to transition to a period of civilian life. So they're unlikely to know about the ways in which civilian governments all work, like how you, for instance, distribute food to individuals without having to rely upon the military. Okay.
Who are the most powerful actors in a post-populist revolution?
So obviously the opposition's argument is going to be something like, well, if you don't let military officials run for public office, then either they'll never support these revolutions, or in the immediate aftermath they'll just launch another coup and take over the government. The suggestions we make to this are twofold. Firstly, it is untrue that the military is the most powerful entity in the immediate aftermath of political revolutions. The reason that kind of political revolutions in order to occur require large-scale public buy-in for the public to engage in things like civil resistance, which make it impossible for the existing government of a country to remain in power, which means that it is true that the military controls like the tanks. Those tanks are relatively meaningless if they don't get cooperation from the general populace. We believe, so therefore we believe that power often vests in those individuals. And secondly, there are often significant incentives if the military is not directly elected into public office for them to be generally cooperative with the government, for instance, in order to secure a beneficial relationship with that government into the future. So it's unlikely that they'll engage in the types of counter coups that the opposition probably imagines. No. Secondly, why is this worse for the country? There are broadly 4 reasons. The first is that in order to satisfy the military officials who seek public office in post-revolution countries are likely to significantly incorporate structures into the new governance structures of that country which benefit the military, for the reason that it both benefits themselves and the individuals who have been taught to prioritise as a result of a long-time devotion to that military. Compare that to the ability of civilian governments to make new structures which are not so dependent upon repaying old debts and so on and so forth. Secondly, for the reason that there's less pressure to normalise affairs in circumstances where military officials seek public office, because the military is unwilling to cede power once it has it in the circumstance where it is elected to positions of public power. It is far more likely to be willing to cede it if in the circumstances that it needs to continue to be, for instance, seen as legitimate by the general public. It's more likely to cede power to a civilian government if that is what it needs to maintain its own legitimacy, which means that it's far more likely that a civilian government would be able to, for instance, pressure the military into giving up its positions of power if it holds those in society, or, for instance, engaging in a day-to-day transition of day-to-day policing as opposed to having military police. Thirdly, the reason that a military official, in order to justify the continued presence of the military in an otherwise what should be civilian government or its government of liberation, needs to justify the continued presence of the military in that government, which means that it is far more likely that the individuals that we're talking about will engage in things like strongman rhetoric in order to justify their position. Because in order to justify why the military still has, relatively unaccountable or undemocratic positions, or why it remains in civilian power, even though why it remains in civilian power, you need to find a reason for you to be there. And often that is to say that means that politicians will say that the military is the only people who can run the country and after it's experienced a state of turmoil. Or secondly, it will often involve things like making up imaginary threats to the revolution in order to continue the justification of a military state of affairs. Fourthly, we would suggest that often it is extremely easy for military officials to do things like stack other public office positions by virtue of the power that they have with other military authorities, which is far less likely to occur in a situation where they do not have direct access to the levers of power, which they were required to do that. Finally, on better revolutions, broadly there are 2 things to note here. Firstly, it's far more likely that these revolutions will be organically driven if you say that it's no longer a viable tactic for the military to attempt to seize power by supporting a revolution and then attempting to control the halls of power in the immediate aftermath. I guess then we'll do all the rest of the stuff later on. Proud to propose.
I thank the Prime Minister for their speech. I'd now like to invite the Leader of the Opposition to begin their case.
A few things in his speech. First of all, some response to what we heard from opening government. Second of all, why we think this undermines democracy. Third of all, why we actually need someone with strong control to establish stability from geopolitical threats. And finally, why this is going to cause a fracturing of the political situation. Firstly, in terms of the Australian News rebuttal, in terms of what we heard from OG. They told us that these people were likely to be bad leaders. That was for 3 reasons. First of all, because they're going to replicate corrupt behaviour. Second of all, because they're going to be militaristic in their thinking. And finally, because we can have ideological leaders, not military leaders. Firstly, in terms of what they said about how they can replicate corrupt behaviour, we think that potentially this is an argument for banning leaders who were a part of the previous government, but we don't think that all of them are. We think that some of them are likely to be separate, and this is probably an over-characterisation. Second of all, in terms of the militaristic thinking, first of all, we don't necessarily think this is a bad thing. We think that the situations that these kind of revolutions are occurring mean that often a very strict militaristic style leadership is important and necessary. Structure is good for the civilians of a country after a revolution. Finally, in terms of how they can have ideological leaders but not military leaders, often we think that they're actually the same thing. We would point to an example like Che Guevara, obviously they can be the same thing. Okay, now this is substantive. First of all, about why we think this undermines democracy. So, just in setup, we think that people who have undergone this revolution and then realise that they cannot elect a military leader who was at the forefront of this revolution, obviously are going to not believe in democracy anymore because they're not able to fulfil the wishes why they went into the revolution in the first place. They're not able to get that leader elected. It's completely contradictory for them. But okay, more importantly in terms of the point. So no matter what, we think that people who run these like military revolutions are going to have power, like and influence over people because they were the ones who started it. First of all, because obviously they created the revolution. Second of all, because they have military power, and we think this directly equates with having cultural power in the kind of countries that we're talking about. But third of all, we think that they're obviously the only person that is capable of uniting the whole country. Obviously, that's the goal of the revolution, and they're clearly the ones that were able to do so. So they obviously have like a substantial amount of power, which means that even if they can't run, they still have the brand and they still have the following, and people are still going to be like likely to listen to them and likely to want to be under the control of them. What is likely to happen is that they're going to kind of run in a de facto style way, which is obviously significantly worse than I'm about to tell you. So literally, how would we rather than run? Would it be like under closed doors, kind of controlling the military, like asserting militaristic power in a way that's like incredibly damaging and is like really bad for the country? Or second of all, as selected officials, where they actually are much more accountable and much more responsible because they have incentives to do so. What we heard from opening government was that the military style would be necessarily bad. What I'm telling you is that it's inevitable. However, under our side, it is significantly better. So why is it significantly better as selective officials? We think that's for 3 reasons. We think first of all, because they're subject to much more scrutiny, because they are accountable. Obviously, when you are the figurehead, when you are the leader of a country, you are directly responsible for that, and so you have much more incentives to sort of be better. But second of all, we think that in terms of an international scale, it is the leaders of the government who engage in diplomacy and engage in relations, so it is good to have like the face of the government be someone who is engaging with people and talking to them, because that's obviously an incredibly important thing, and it is better to have them doing that kind of up forefront rather than doing sort of backdoor deals. But finally, we think that it encourages central government power versus keeping the government weak in order to keep the military strong and the military kind of leading from behind. It is much better to have like a much more open, much more obvious central government power, which we think that this would create. Second point is about why we need someone with strong control to establish stability with geopolitical threats. So we think that the context of the countries that we're talking about are often subject to extreme external threats. They're often violent threats, they're often dangerous threats that need to be fended off. What we get onto our side is that you have a military leader at the head. Having an image of a military leader, as stupid as it might sound, makes the country seem potentially less as more of a threat, and you're less likely to want to go and intervene and less likely to want to invade or whatever, because you have someone more strong at the forefront. We think that's an important thing because of the kind of context we're talking about. Note that the difference between having someone as a figurehead and as a military, as the leader versus just as a military kind of side person is extensive, in that as soon as someone becomes like the leader of the government, it is just like very different the way that they're perceived and the kind of power they have and the importance that sort of people relate to them. Okay, third point about why it would be likely that the political situation would be fractured if they weren't able to be elected into office. So we think that obviously, as I've already said, it's going to be more damaging for democracy, because countries that have gone under these revolutions obviously have extremely divided populations. That is for religious reasons often. There are a lot of internal tensions, and so we think that in the absence of military leaders and sort of military control, tensions are likely to escalate. Military leaders are likely to have the information and the capital and the knowledge about how to deal with these sort of internal tensions. Tensions we think that are extremely bad, particularly after a revolution, and ones that we ought to avoid, because putting these countries into even further kind of disarray is an extremely bad thing. Obviously, it's just going to divide people. It's going to create more chaos, and people need as much stronghold as possible, and they need someone who they obviously are in favour of, considering the fact that they've just gone to revolution for them, to be leading them together after a period of chaotic behaviour and after a period of revolution. So at the end of the speech, I've told you, first of all, why it undermines democracy if they're not even given the potential to run. Second of all, why it is going to be better in terms of creating a less chaotic country. And finally, in terms of geopolitical threats, very, very proud to oppose.
I thank the leader of the opposition for their speech. I now like to
Bella tells you that maybe our mechanisms are reason to not let people from the old government or from the old guard, run for power rather than members of the military. But that ignores what we told you from Kevin, which is that obviously to be a military official, you are part of the military that was part of the old guard. Just because you are literally not a politician does not mean you are not part of that system that had operated before. The way that, and this is what I think Owen misses in this debate, the way that uprisings occur is that popular dissent swells and swells to a point that it is no longer viable or no longer strategically beneficial for the military to continue supporting the old guard, and so they then kind of switch gears and back the population. It is not that they kind of often institute those, or they are like the most significant figureheads of that movement. That obviously is not how it works, and that is why all of our material still stands. That the military officials are the ones who are most likely, for instance, to still bear some level of connection to that old guard, or for instance, are more likely to have been corrupt or kind of do anything to have gotten to that point, because by definition, there were people who kind of switched gears when it seemed most strategic. The people we should prioritize and the people who are going to do the best job of running and restructuring this country were the civilians, and that is why we won this debate. So, firstly, I'm going to whip the stuff on why these people are unsuited for public office, because I think this gets startlingly little response. All that we are told from OO is, well, you often need somebody with strong control. Firstly, this ignores the fact that obviously the military, to some extent, will still have some power and some say in how this country is restructured, in that it is unlikely that the civilian government will completely cut ties with our military, because it's in their interest as well to maintain some sort of positive relationship with that military, because you want to know that if it were needed to call upon that military, they would kind of back you essentially. But the other thing I think to note, aside from all of the mechanisms that Kevin tells you that still stand, things like, for instance, you're likely to be particularly bad at engaging in reunification when you are more directly responsible for deaths that were in that uprising, and therefore you are less likely to do things like make good concessions or hold relevant people to account, or for instance, that you're likely to feed into militaristic mindsets or militaristic techniques of running the country rather than ones that are maybe good for restructuring kind of a country raw and fresh out of the wake of an uprising. Is these individuals often don't even really want to be in government. That is to say that it's not necessarily that they have some kind of specific platform that they stand for, that they believe in, a clear sense of ideology that they want to institute. It's often just kind of the potential of being elected and having power that just tempts them to run. It is often not that they have a strong policy platform in the first place, which is to say they have all of the reasons or weaknesses why they would be bad. Things like they have the wrong kind of mindset, they have the wrong kind of connections to that old guard, but they do not have any, there's no kind of imperative for us to want. There's not even like one reason why we want those people. That is to say they often do not have a clear vision or a clear sense or a clear platform they are running on, and therefore it is unlikely that they are suited for public office. No, this does not mean that we do not think they are appropriate to have any kind of say. We just think it is probably best that they do not hold positions within specifically that civilian government. But secondly then, on why this is worse for the country more broadly. So, if it is true, as OO says, that the military is as power hungry as they claim, then all of their material is totally uncomparative, which is to say, if it is true that they are that power hungry, it just seems way worse to directly place them in positions of power, not only to do that, but to do it under the facade that they are operating democratically at all times, or are making decisions that are in the interest of the people, and letting them kind of, play chess games with positions of authority and entrench a militaristic regime, because it's obviously in their interest for that militaristic regime to be the one that continues, because they operate on things like fixed hierarchies and kind of positions of authority. That just seems way worse. That is to say, all of their harms are obviously kind of accumulate worse under their side when you directly give them control of those positions of power. All of our reasons as to why they are worse for the country still stand. Things like they are likely to prioritize the military, where the civilian government is able to restructure, that there is less pressure to normalize the military and entrench the military's power if it is primarily a civilian government. And also note again that this gets very little response, that there is a necessity if you are a militaristic kind of leader, not only if you get elected, but if you are even just running for a position of power in that civilian government, it is necessary for you to justify your military presence uniquely in the civilian government. That is to say, you are likely to build barriers or scare tactics around the need for a strong military presence. That obviously will always inflame tensions. If it is true that the country suffers from kind of divisions and things like that in the wake of the uprising, it does not seem like a good idea to give people in the military an active incentive to inflame those tensions in order to reinforce the reason why a military presence is strongly needed in that country, why you need to actively have armies, cracking down on things like political tension. That does not seem like a good idea. That incentive exists way less when there is no need to jostle for that power. Note also, as Kevin was flagging in his speech, internal jostling for power, obviously, within the military is also likely to diffuse a little bit if there is no need to fight for an actual position in the civilian government, and the military kind of remains in the structures that they were in. So all of those things still stand and kind of still have not received a response. Before I move on to breaking down what Bella does tell us closing.
Obviously, these problems in individuals have power and influence parallel to the current regime of governments. What makes you think that they would stop pursuing these ambitious goals that they already have, independent of whether or not this policy goes through with those levels of power?
Well, so as in, I think the difference is that even if they have kind of goals or they have, reasons to want power, and I think this kind of also responds to O's stuff about how they can still assert power, there are no real mechanisms, or at least mechanisms that, let's be comparative here. Whatever mechanisms they do have are obviously going to be much more difficult for you to assert power than to directly place you in a position of power in a civilian government. So again, I think it's important to be comparative. While they tell you, you're likely to be more subject to scrutiny if you are in a position of power in a civilian government. Obviously, to the extent that you are a high-ranking official in the military, you probably just don't care about scrutiny that much. You have the entire whims of the military in your control. That mechanism falls down. They then tell you, well, there's now a perception that things are undemocratic. Firstly, your belief in democracy doesn't just disappear because you couldn't elect this one person. But as I flagged in my intro, people don't often, in the wake of an uprising, feel a strong affinity towards the military because they are also aware that the uprising happened because of popular dissent and that the military just came in to back them when it was no longer viable for them to continue supporting the old guard. It's untrue that people feel some sort of strong connection to the military and feel like people in the military deserve roles in the civilian government. But to the extent that they do, they are likely to still cooperate with that civilian government and still have some level of say. They then say you are less likely to have foreign interference. I just do not think the distinction is clear enough here. What is the difference between having specifically a military official in your civilian government and just having the civilian government working with a powerful military that can still can fight back against foreign interference? Bella just asserts that there is a clear distinction and doesn't explain why. Finally, they then say they are better at suppressing tensions within the country. Obviously, the military is subject to the same political tensions, but the problem is they are kind of less able to reconcile those things or able to crack down on them in more violent ways. If it is true that they are subject to things like political biases, if it is true that they are subject to things like being power hungry, it does not seem clear to me why we ought to hand them positions of power in which they can directly manipulate that. We've won this debate.
I thank the Deputy Prime Minister for the speech, and I'd like to call upon the Deputy Leader of the Opposition to conclude their.
So many speeches and yet not one mention of an actual alternative of who comes to power in this debate. Closing government is going to prove to you why the alternatives are equally problematic for those of the military, and while the harms inherent to that this side is saying are inherent to the military coming to power can also occur on other sides with leaders of the revolution taking over or other alternatives like religious leaders taking over, and why it is therefore important that we defer to a norm of democracy to those people. Let's deal with CG first. Their argument is that consent can't happen because people are scared of the military. That's silly because people are scared of the person with guns, which will be controlled by the government anyway, and also likely to be true of the guerrilla fighters that you guys have to support as well, and any other fighter or any other person with substantial backing either. They also later go on to contradict this completely by saying sometimes it is the will of the people to vote in the old government. In that case, they're obviously not afraid of them, and that person will not be elected if it is not the will of those people. That fear factor doesn't matter because that person is likely to be disempowered. Let's note this takes place in the immediate aftermath after everybody won and beat the military, if that is true in their world, so it's probably not likely to be the case. The second thing they say is that it will backtrack democracy. They don't actually explain this argument. They just say because people can't consent, it is not facilitating the goal of democracy, which doesn't actually explain why it sets back the institution by maximising participation of people who can run. But the better thing that we tell you in POI that also goes unresponded to, is that even if it is not a real election, that it may be in fact rigged to some extent or not happening in the most perfect of circumstances because it is the immediate aftermath, it is important to establish a norm of democracy where it appears to be real, where people can participate, because as they correctly note, it is far harder to backtrack those norms once they're established, particularly in the formation of a new identity and a new government. Their last and I think worst claim is that they're going to be inherently regressive. Not clear why that's true. The military have backed the People's Revolution by their characterization. They probably just care about military things, which don't necessarily have a political leaning either. Often populist revolutions can be incredibly militaristic and very pro the military, so it is unclear why it is always a left-wing revolution we're talking about. And the other thing to say is, if it is inherently unpopular popular, they will be the minority on that government. They will be the ones who will have to compromise as well. The thing they also miss, which is worse, is that if they are pandering to a group of people who will likely vote them in, i.e. a large majority of wealthy people, those people still exist. They need to be catered for in this new government, or your new government will fall apart and it will not work, and the revolution will fall apart and it will not work. Having them on board allowed moderates to come to the table, allowed for that compromise and that new government to be established fully as well. That's why it was important to actually look at the alternatives in this debate. We think there's a couple of scenarios that you could possibly turn to other than military leaders. The first is that leaders of the movement. John want a knife opening opposition. I would never do that to them because that's bad. But I also kind of think that guerrilla leaders are not the military because they're fighting against the military. It's just food for thought. But what that means is maybe if they are the military, there are definitely other ideologues, for example, who are not part of the military. It's not for no answer though. And what that means is that they're isolated from that fighting, they're inherently ideological, they've led a political revolution based on ideas rather than a military revolution based on military might, and that comes with a few things. One is that they have the burden of representing that revolution in a way that other politicians simply do not. That makes it incredibly difficult for them to ever compromise and ever make any changes that are actually effective. For example, we think this often leads to splintering and factioning of that dominant group in a way that is often harmful and contrary to what they want to achieve. And it also means they're not inherently experienced. That's why the harms of opening government simply were not unique or mutually exclusive to that of the military. We think you could equally have deeply inexperienced, deeply strongman rhetoric coming from the figurehead of the revolution who led us all to glory. Those were not mutually exclusive options. In fact, they were likely to dial down when you had a bit of competition in the actual democracy plan, and people could actually trade off those ideas against each other. Yes?
We don't claim that the alternative leaders have to be perfect. The thing that's unique to military leaders is that they have a unique incentive to enshrine one institution, that is the structure of the military, in the structure of governance of the new country, particularly given that it's likely to be weakened in the aftermath of the
But political leaders have equal incentives to enshrine their political party as a dominant figure in that resistance. Religious leaders have an equal incentive to enshrine their religion as a dominant institution in that. So what we've correctly identified is that different parties and different people have different leanings and different preferences as what institutions should be dominant in that society. It's not up to me to decide for the populist society whether we pick religion over the military or whether religion should be picked over politics. It's probably best to divert it to the people who led the revolution and want to vote on that thing as well. So that is not actually a mutually exclusive harm. The second thing to say is often leaders of the movement lack state building because they are often based by intellectuals who are university students and had access to information that the general public did not. That what often allows them to galvanize things like different guerrilla movements and things like that because they can motivate people like farmers and motivate people who are isolated from information and play the political game in a way that other people cannot. That means that they can do things, that means that they often lack the ability to build institutions in the same way that the military might be comparatively better at building institutions because they are used to doing things like, for example, providing aid or building buildings and doing structures like that and having things like tanks and trucks which allow you to carry things. So that is actually comparative benefit for the military. But it is not mutually exclusive in that way either. The second thing to say is often people will defer to religious leaders, and that is not inherently more democratic or less democratic in that religions have huge incentives to enshrine things like civil law that reflects that of their religion, which is not necessarily reflective of the people's wants. But we recognize that we would let them run, and we would let political leaders run, even though they have those conflicting perspectives, because they represent a portion of the public that necessarily must come to the table and must be catered for democracy to work. I'll quickly say closing.
I mean, realistically, we believe that the difference is that you are able to more meaningfully consent to these people because you do not, for example, constantly fear that they're going to use the remnants of the old army to kill you if you don't.
Well, if that's the case, that's even a better incentive to bring them into a governmental structure and bring them under the control of the actual government. And it's unclear why you would be scared of the remnants of the actual army coming to get you, more scared than guerrilla fighters coming to get you, or more scared than people fighting on behalf of religious terrorism coming to get you either. Those aren't mutually exclusive harms, so I think your extension falls down. So that's why it's like not necessarily inherent to religious leaders either. The other thing that might happen as well, speculatively, is that maybe business interests or corporate, not corporate entities, but like people who are business inclined is not an identity, but in that respect, in controllers of the market, may also take interest in building populist revolutions and dominating in that way, but we think those are equal incentives that can be balanced as well. We gave you alternatives, they weren't perfect, the military wasn't either, but it was definitely something that people could consent to and should be able to choose.
go. The first and key question in this debate is, are populations unusually inclined to vote in favour of military leaders in a way that does not rationally reflect their preference, but instead affects something else? This issue, if won, does an enormous amount of work for us in a way that relatively decisively allows us to take the debate. Firstly, it obviously single-handedly takes out the bulk of what closing opposition just told you, because if there is a difference in terms of your ability to consent to voting for a revolution leader or a religious leader or a civic leader and a military leader, then obviously that is the determining factor. Secondly, it does a lot of work in mediating the opening half clash, which is predominantly concerning itself with the idea as to there are some ups and some downs to having these people in place. If you are not able to consent to them, then that likely implies that they are not necessarily there in a way that the electorate has deemed, in fact, in service of their needs. Thirdly, this issue introduces the harm of a lack of accountability. That is to say, even if they are actually good at their jobs, like let's say they have the traits of competence, they are not able to be properly held accountable, which means we can counterfactually know that they will perform worse than other people who are accountable in that form. And fourthly, because it introduces the harm that open opposition discusses of the violation of these people's rights to democracy. So let us see if we have met that burden, acknowledging with that set of entirely uncontested weighing factors that Leah gives you. If we are able to demonstrate these things, we have won the debate. Leah gives you 4 reasons. One of them is stolen from opening opposition, and thus rebutting it in George's speech would have been a knife, which is why it is good that she didn't rebut any of the specific mechanisms. But obviously, it is that the leader is as opening opposition notes, key to a lot of the control of the immediate aftermath of this. And when you think about it, the opposition bench has a funny view, and I know this is a small example, but they have a funny view as to what expertise of trucks implies. Because a lot of their case is like, well, you would be a good leader because you are used to using trucks. But of course, these people are not used to the use of trucks in order to, for example, facilitate commerce. They are merely the owners of trucks that they then use to deploy various forms of weaponry. So on the vital truck axis, we are the team that demonstrates that they have a problematic relationship with trucks because they are able to hold the hostage of trucks from the populace, but they do not actually have any inherent knowledge about how to use them in service of the goal that you would pursue. That is the first reason that they are different. And actually, critically, when you think about it, that also fits in pretty well to one of the good things that George has said about military leaders. Secondly, we explained these people are uniquely scared and threatened. Now, George's response to this set of things, which I think is sensible, is to ask us to defend, well, why wouldn't they wouldn't be scared of other groups like guerrilla leaders or just like the concept of the government? The difference is, of course, the third reason that Leah gives you, which is that these are people that come from contexts of low information, they come from contexts of like post-oppression trauma, and they come from contexts in which they have likely had personal engagements with that form of paramilitary, which means that these people's faces will be uniquely terrifying. Juxtapose that to the other groups, like a state as a concept is not personified in the same way. Guerrilla leaders are ones that, generally speaking, in order to have succeeded in a revolution, have won over the trust of at least the majority of the population, so people are not necessarily afraid that they will try to kill them. And religious leaders, of course, well, why would you be scared of them if you weren't in the religion? You know, it's like a priest we're talking about. There was no characterization, that's why you would be afraid of that person. So you are likely to be more afraid of these people, which means you're more inclined to vote for them. Thirdly, the artifice of their old established orders have not yet necessarily disappeared. It is likely that in the immediate aftermath of a chaotic and often confusing shift in governmental structure, people will temporarily retain their military might, which means that much of the old rank they will continue to pursue, and even if they don't, they will still often have a lot of people that valorize them and do what they say. That then means that they are better able to engage in projects like election rigging and ballot stuffing, as Leah tells you, or just election supervision, which can intimidate voters. Critically, this rebuts, I think, the most ludicrous part of closing opposition's extension, which is the idea that people need to get in the habit of voting, as if the lack of muscle memory is precisely the problem. Like, obviously the problem is that people do not have the norm of voting, right? Like, indistinct from the as in our extension is like the democracy does not meaningfully exist. People are getting used to and developing the norm of voting for people on the basis of fear. Yours is like, they should do that because the mechanics of writing and putting it in a box is more important than not being afraid all the time. You know, like,
a hard, fuck me. So, I think at the end of that, and then Georgia said that we had a contradiction, but it was really one of those. It was really like in and out of these guys. I honestly, it was so nuts. She was like, they had this contradiction because they had one argument, and then they had an argument that applied to a separate set of actors with a separate mechanism, leading to a separate conclusion on a separate timescale. And then she was like, it's a conclusion. And if that trick plays, then I think Georgia's speech had about like 13 claims in like a numerical sense, and each of them in interesting, prismatic ways contradicts one another. So if we have a burden to dispute that one, then Jonah is going to give a good speech. Let's see what I'm going to say. Closing?
The speech sucks, but do you think more people are going to be scared of the military if they're physically barred from participating in an election they wish to participate in?
Oh, no, I really don't think so at all. So this speaks to the second thing that I want to talk about here, which is the reaction of the military, broadly speaking. And I think this fits into this issue as well. I think weirdly, opening opposition gives a pretty good narrative as to what they will do. Like, the military does not want to disrupt the whole society, obviously. They don't want to plunge the place back into civil war in which there is a risky set of winners and losers. So instead what they will do is exactly what opening opposition says, which is that they will like place some sort of proxy who will still run in the election. And that is of course imperfect for all of the reasons that opening opposition suggests to you. But it also provides a perfect vector for that problem, like in that sort of that thing, which really limits the harm. And as I think is quite clear, having that degree of lack of separation accountability, but also the lack of the factor that we're talking about, means that is still comparatively far better in this circumstance. The final thing that I want to talk about relatively briefly is identity. And I think basically Georgia's responses to the stuff that we described to you here belie the fact that it is our opening opposition's mechanism that we're using. Because they have this really funny argument hidden away that was just like, well, what we need to do is tell other countries that we're led by a military leader so they don't invade us. The signalling of that, the signalling of being led by a military leader and having campaigns that are militaristic, right? Because our opening discusses the ways in which that can potentially permeate through the democracy in the short term. But the critical thing that we identify impacting this argument, that is I think really important, is that these countries are still fulfilling civic norms about what democracy means. And when that is militarized in its earliest stages, that mechanism implies that this will become a country that is more violent. We are the team that gets free and open elections. That is why we are the team that wins this debate.
I think the
I think that the primary issue with the entirety of the opposition bench is that they have so far been totally incoherent with regards to identifying motivations, or in any sense, really, the characterization of any of the actors they want to talk about when they talk about these kinds of pathological figures in the military. This leads to them inevitably tripping over their own material and causing massive contradictions with regards to like, how do these actors behave, what are their motivations, and what does this mean they will actually do? What are their patterns of behavior, and how will this actually instantiate in the real world? Firstly, on opening opposition. Secondly, on the case built off of spit and opening opposition's material. Firstly, with regards to opening opposition, they have two main pushes in this debate. The first of which is that people who run for office post-revolution are likely to be dangerous for a number of personality factors that they identify. And second of all, about how military leaders are poor at unification and state building. With regards to the first point, I think that this is, as I flagged in my introduction, a key indicator of where the opposition bench falls down in a large number of respects. Because potentially, yes, they are dangerous figures, but what does this actually mean when you consider the counterfactual in which they are forced to remain in the military? What is likely to happen, we tell you, is that they're going to be attempting to consolidate their power base within the military, since they already have a large number of ties to that military in the first instance. Additionally, we think that since it is then necessary for a vast number of the populace to then have some degree of respect for the military insofar as they are willing to vote for the military, I think it is then necessarily likely that it is then necessary for opposition to recognize that this means that they have power irrespective of whether or not they participate in the political process. This then means that they are capable of exercising that influence in ways which are considerably more destructive, since they no longer operate along the axis of the government in the first instance. Obviously, the military still loves them since they are the leaders of the military. Second of all, we think that people are, as I've already identified, likely to at least fear them to an extent in which they are willing to cooperate with their actions.
Thirdly, we think that they're also able to move significantly more directly to sabotage governments since they are at conflict with the government that would otherwise exist in the counterfactual. Now note that OG tells you that they don't want to upset the government, but consider that this is significantly likely to be untrue, since in the immediate aftermath of, first of all, in the immediate aftermath of revolution, a lot of governments aren't likely to have the necessary checks and balances to keep the military in check in this regard. But additionally, we think that given they have popular support, whether or not they are in power in the first instance, I think that it is significantly unlikely that they care about the government when they have the military mind, which opening opposition seems like so intent on them having in the first instance. Moving on to the point about how military leaders abhor unification, we have three main responses to their three main pushes. Firstly, with regards to the idea that since they are directly responsible for deaths, they are divisive. We think that, first of all, civilian leaders are obviously fine with the bloodshed that propelled them to power in the first instance, regardless of whether or not they were actually present and on the front lines of the military conflict in the first instance. And additionally, we think that they are open to accusations of cowardice in regards to this, about not being able to accept the fact that bloodshed was necessary for them to actually take power, about not being willing to accept the fact that they necessarily had to use violence in order to quell the populace. Second of all, with regards to the idea that they are less willing to hold their own to account, we think that first of all, it is true that in the counterfactual, as Georgia proposes, it is likely to be, for example, revolutionary cabals of intelligentsia, who are likely to either likely to overlook the flaws of their own because they all follow one political ideology, and that ideology unifies them to a much greater extent, and therefore makes them significantly more willing to overlook the mistakes of their colleagues. But additionally, we think that insofar as they do attempt to hold each other to account, they do so in the most destructive manner possible, which is likely that of heated ideological debate about relatively minor topics. To see an example of this in action, consider the fact that me and Connor have never gotten along well. We often spend time yelling about fucking mixed markets instead of talking nicely. Thirdly, with regards to the idea of how they are unlikely to know how civilian governments work, Beach basically writes this off by making a whole extended trucks argument to come for the fact that nothing he has is actually responsive. But in actuality, we make the point about how military leaders are capable of, for example, having existing supply chains, since they obviously need a significant amount of logistical rigor in order to operate as a functioning military. But secondly, we also think that they are significantly better at being able to hold the populace to account and prevent additional counter-revolutions from occurring, insofar as they are the best at, for example, using state violence to stop people from rioting and thereby placing the government in additionally treacherous situations when it comes time for old remnants of the government to start flaring up once more. Moving on to closing government then, having demolished the opening opposition case. The main push in this debate is one about the inability to consent, and I think that this is conclusively disproven at Georgia, but in case you missed that, I'm going to reiterate the reason why this is the case. I think the first and most important reason is that their primary burden in terms of whether or not a leader has too much power for the population to consent is that they have this analysis also necessarily applies to leaders of revolutions regardless of how they materialize. And the first reason to see why that is the case is that obviously, if you have the necessary power to quell the military, it is significantly more likely that you have, in fact, committed violence against dissidents in order to secure your regime in the first instance. I think that it is significantly, almost impossible for any revolution of this scale to be conducted peacefully without additionally the fear of reprisal come time, given the fact that obviously the fear of mob rule is quite significant, and therefore, even on just a popular level, people who don't support the revolution in the first case are likely to be worried about this kind of thing anyway. Why shouldn't this argument about lack of consent apply to them as well? But additionally, we think that by and large, a lot of the people and government structures have, in fact, tendencies to commit this kind of suppressive violence in the first case, which means that then all of their harms manifest regarding the idea that they have too much power and they are therefore counted by it.
All of the material you give about why the military has, for instance, more expertise in handling logistics are also reasons to believe why the military will just continue to do things their way once they're in government, therefore entrenching in the long term the structures of the military and the government instead of handing power back to civilians.
Right, but I think that again, this is the problem Georgia points out, which is that this is an argument not for specifically the reasons why military leaders are bad, but the reasons for why nepotism is a bad thing, and nepotism will always exist regardless of how a revolution eventuates, because obviously there needs to be a party that wins. This party will have self-interests with regards to protecting itself and ensuring it perpetuates into the future. Therefore, all of the benefits of all of the harms apply regardless of how this revolution happens in the first instance. The second and weaker push that closing opposition have is that this somehow reverses the luck of revolution, again because of what Georgia points out to you regarding like the characterization of revolutions as strictly being diametrically opposed to the military. We think this is untrue in a number of cases, but in a number of cases where like the opposite characterization is true, we think that firstly, in the aftermath of a revolution, obviously it's going to be significantly easier to depose a leader of a relatively speaking weak military in terms of like, obviously these people were overthrown once already, therefore it is going to be fairly easy to then overthrow them again, especially if everyone else has already agreed that they're kind of bad people and they don't support the ideals of the revolution. Having successfully demolished the laughable extension that they provide, I think we conclusively win the debate since we provide better responses to a vast majority of opening opposition's material and we are capable of engaging them on their best characterizations. Thank you.